Hello and welcome back to the Fantasy Playmakers. What is up, guys? A few days ago, I put out my first set of 2022 positional rankings, so I went through my top 12 running backs, and so today it's time to go through my top 12 wide receivers. And while you guys are watching, if you're enjoying the content, just do me a huge favor, hit that like button, and then subscribe to the channel if you are not already subscribed. But let's honestly just jump right into it. Starting off here at the top, at number 1, I have Cooper Kupp. He was the pretty clear wide receiver 1 from the 2021 season. He actually averaged 4.4 more points per game than Davante Adams, who was number 2 on a points per game basis. He was number 1 in targets, receptions, target share, red zone targets, receiving yards, yards after the catch, and touchdowns at the wide receiver position. So just dominant all across the board. And he should be in a fairly similar situation in 2022. We'll see what happens with Odell Beckham. Maybe they re-sign him. Maybe they don't. I would expect Robert Woods, to be back there after that ACL injury. But if we remember, early in the season, Cooper Kupp was just as dominant as he was down the stretch. And so I think, barring any major changes, he should have a solid chance to repeat as the wide receiver 1 or just finish up there, in the top 5. Now at number 2, I'm going to go with Justin Jefferson, and he followed up his historic rookie season with an even more impressive sophomore year. He finished as the wide receiver 4 in points per game. He was number 1 in air yards, number 1 in air yard share, and number 1 in deep targets. And then he was number 4 in targets and receptions, and then number 3 in target share. So another really impressive, numbers all across the board. And if Kirk Cousins stays with the Vikings, I think that would definitely be his best case scenario. I do think there's a decent chance they move on from him, and that could kind of shake these rankings up a little bit because I don't know if you're going to have an upgrade at quarterback over Kirk Cousins. He's not a top-tier guy, but he's definitely at least league average and can support his weapons. So, if they move away from Kirk, go to a younger, less experienced option, that could definitely drop Justin Jefferson a few slots, especially because the wide receiver position is pretty stacked. At number 3, I have Davante Adams. He was the number 1 wide receiver in 2020 and then finished as the number 2 wide receiver in 2021. And here's the thing. If both Rodgers and Davante Adams both return to the Packers, I think Adams would be a top 2 wide receiver. He would be ahead of Justin Jefferson no matter what happens. And you could probably make an argument between Adams and Kupp. I would favor Kupp, but I don't think you'd be crazy to go with Davante Adams at number 1. But there is a lot of uncertainty here if Aaron Rodgers leaves because it's very likely the Packers are going to franchise tag Davante Adams. So I would expect him to stay with the Packers. But the thing is, if Rodgers is gone, this is a drastically worse situation. I think it's very, very unlikely, he finds a better situation than the one he has in Green Bay with Aaron Rodgers. So, if A-Rod leaves, he gets a new quarterback, he would definitely still be a solid wide receiver 1, but I just don't think he would have the ceiling of being like a top 5 guy, and I would have to put players like Tyreek Hill, Jamar Chase, and probably even a guy like Deebo Samuel over Davante heading into 2022. At number 4, I have Tyreek Hill, and he kind of had a slightly underwhelming fantasy season. He finished as the wide receiver 6 in points per game, but he was being drafted as like the number 2 wide receiver overall. But he just kind of struggled to put together consistent numbers on a week-to-week basis. He didn't have a very high weekly floor, but he definitely still showed that massive weekly ceiling with some huge boom games. Going into 2022, he's going to be attached to one of the most explosive offenses in the NFL, playing alongside one of the best NFL quarterbacks. So I still think, he has a great shot to be a high-end wide receiver 1 next season. Moving on to number 5, I have Jamar Chase, and he actually finished as the wide receiver 5 in points per game as a rookie, which is just crazy, crazy impressive. And this past season, Jamar Chase was very, very efficient, without receiving an elite level target share. He was 17th in the NFL in targets and 23rd in target share. So normally to be like a top 5 guy, you probably want to be like top 10 in target share, at least like top 15. Jamar Chase was 23rd and still balled out because he still managed to finish with the 4th most receiving yards, 4th most completed air yards, and 5th most yards after the catch, while also getting into the end zone 13 times. So that kind of points to that efficiency there And that efficiency may decrease going into 2022. It may be, slightly unsustainable, but I also think you can expect a jump from him, as a player and just in terms of his overall target share going into year 2. I do think the Bengals could kind of expand, their pass attempts per game, which is something I'll get to later on in this list. At number 6, I've got Deebo Samuel. Definitely just one of the most fun players to watch this past season. He finished as the 3rd best wide receiver in points per game, and he really just got it done in the air and on the ground. Production from all over the place. He caught 77 passes for 1,405 receiving yards and 6 receiving touchdowns. So that right there is a very, very solid stat line, but he just totally added to that on the ground. He had 365 rushing yards and 8 rushing touchdowns. I think going into 2022, we could see a slight decrease in his overall touches, especially out of the backfield, just because with Trey Lance taking over, they may run more QB runs, QB design plays for Trey Lance, but I still think he should be a very solid wide receiver 1 next season. At number 7, I'm going to go with Stefon Diggs, who I think overall had a fairly disappointing 2021 season. I think a lot of people viewed him as a top 3 wide receiver heading into the season. He finished as the wide receiver 10 in points per game, so still a wide receiver 1, just didn't have that top tier finish that I think a lot of people were counting on, but he still put together a very well-rounded season. Number 5 in targets, number 8 in receptions, number 7 in receiving yards, and number 7 in touchdowns. So top 10 in all of those important categories. Just didn't have that elite, high-level weekly ceiling. But going into 2021, he's still going to be the alpha wide receiver on a top-tier passing attack with one of the best quarterbacks in the NFL in Josh Allen. So I'd feel very confident with Stefon Diggs as like a mid-tier wide receiver 1 play. Then at number 8, I've got Diontae Johnson, and he just continues to develop and improve as a wide receiver year after year. He finished as the wide receiver 9 in points per game, despite dealing with just absolutely horrible quarterback play. This offense only threw for 4,014 yards and 23 touchdowns. That yardage number isn't horrible. The touchdowns are definitely low. And, you could definitely make an argument that Diontae Johnson benefited, from the number of pass attempts the Steelers had per game because he did have the 2nd most targets in the NFL, but his overall ceiling was just totally zapped by Big Ben. Diontae Johnson is not just like a short wide receiver, in terms of yardage. Like, he's not just one of these 5-yard slant guys, and that's the only thing he can do. He is very well-rounded. The problem is just that Big Ben could not push the ball down the field, so he was limited to that quick, short passing attack, and he obviously thrived, but he could do much more if he had a much better quarterback. I feel like he's one of the only players who almost gets zinged for having bad quarterback play. It's like people think somehow Big Ben is making Diontae Johnson. That could not be farther from the truth. Big Ben is greatly holding him back. So I'm not really sure how much of an upgrade they can get at quarterback this offseason. Maybe they bring in a veteran. Maybe they draft someone. I just don't really think it can get much worse than it was last year. And he's already proven he could be a wide receiver 1 with very little help around him. So I think, a mid to back end wide receiver 1 ranking is actually pretty fair for Diontae Johnson. Moving on to A.J. Brown, who I have coming in as my wide receiver 9. After Brown put together an elite 2020 season, he definitely took a step back in 2021, and I think a lot of people were expecting him to take a huge jump from that 2020 season. It just did not happen. He finished 28th in points per game, so definitely a letdown. But personally, I'm just going to be buying back in to A.J. Brown's talent and his overall ceiling, first on a week-to-week basis, but also just overall for an entire season. And I'm kind of just going to chalk it up to a very dysfunctional Titans offense. Somehow they ended up getting the 1 seed, but there were problems all over the place. Derrick Henry missed like half of the regular season. Ryan Tannehill greatly regressed. Julio was in and out of the lineup the entire year and didn't produce when he did play. A.J. Brown missed 4 games, so he was also dealing with injuries, but he still managed to have a really solid 27% target share, which shows he is going to be the focal point of this offense. And he did show some huge boom weeks. So I definitely think A.J. Brown can rebound in 2022. Now to finish out the top 10, I have Mike Evans. And I have Mike Evans here assuming that Tom Brady is going to be back. If Brady's gone, we need to reevaluate this whole offense, because, it could be a wide spectrum of quarterbacks They could go out, acquire an elite veteran, or you could be rolling with Kyle Trask or Blaine Gabbert or someone on that level. So there's just such a wide range here. I'm just going to assume that Brady is back. Hopefully we get to see him out there for at least one more season. But when Tom Brady's on the field, Mike Evans should be locked in as a very solid wide receiver one. Mike Evans has been one of the most reliable wide receivers of all time when we're looking at, a year-to-year perspective. He may be a little bit volatile week to week, very high ceiling, doesn't have a super established floor, but over a year-to-year basis, Mike Evans has played 8 NFL seasons, and he has played at least 13 games every single year. He has at least 1,000 receiving yards every single season, and the lowest number of fantasy points he has produced per game is 13.5 PPR points. So he has scored over that in every single season he has played in. So overall, I just think Mike Evans has a really solid combination of safety, from a year-to-year perspective, and then just a very high ceiling because we know he can put up those huge yardage, huge touchdown seasons. Now at number 11, I hinted to this a little bit earlier, but I have Tee Higgins, and going into the 2022 season, I expect Higgins to be one of the most undervalued players. He finished the 2021 season as the wide receiver 13 in points per game. He definitely started slow, but absolutely tore it up towards the end of the season. And you're looking at that wide receiver 13 finish. He did that while only scoring 6 touchdowns in 14 games. So he actually got fairly unlucky in terms of his touchdown production. We know we can get into the end zone. It's not an issue with Tee Higgins' talent. Sometimes it's just kind of the way things break, and it didn't break great for him, but I think that is going to make him a value moving forward. I also think the Bengals are going to shift to a more pass-heavy approach, especially if they can shore up that offensive line. I feel like they went pretty run-heavy because you don't want to have Joe Burrow standing back there getting killed. He was already one of the most sacked quarterbacks, and that was with them not throwing the ball an absurd amount of times. So if that does happen, I think we could realistically see both Tee Higgins and Jamar Chase finish as top 10 fantasy wide receivers, on the overall season or just on a points per game basis. And now we have the final player in the top 12. It is going to be Jaylen Waddle. And I do want to give some honorable mentions here. Actually, I think it's like 4 or 5 guys, because like I mentioned earlier, the wide receiver position is definitely stacked. First honorable mention goes to Keenan Allen. He should be a borderline wide receiver 1. I really liked him going into last year. He performed very well. I just don't know if he has that top tier ceiling like some of the other players on this list. Next up is CeeDee Lamb. Kind of disappointed overall. We'll see what happens this offseason, but definitely a very talented wide receiver. Then we've got DK Metcalf. What happens with Russell Wilson? If Russ returns, I do think DK Metcalf will have a bounce back season, but his struggles this year leave him off the initial top 12. And then the final wide receiver is Chris Godwin. And the only reason he is not on this list, assuming Brady returns, is because he is dealing with that ACL tear. So will he be ready by week 1? We don't know. But if Brady comes back and Godwin looks like he's full strength to play week 1, I will be valuing him as a top 12 wide receiver. But to break down the final player on this list, Jaylen Waddle, he finished as the wide receiver 14 in points per game as a rookie. So super, super impressive. He should take another step forward going into 2021. And we'll just kind of see how this Dolphins team expands his usage. And I'm wondering if they'll finally kind of use him down the field. Overall, his ceiling may be a little bit capped playing with Tua, unless Tua takes that huge leap. Because we know that Jaylen Waddle can win down the field, we know he's a yak monster. But if Tua can't really hit him there, they may just want to use him as a more of a possession guy, which we saw in 2021. But that is going to wrap it up for my top 12 wide receivers. If you guys enjoyed this video, do me a huge favor, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel. I'm going to be putting out my top 12 quarterbacks and tight ends next week, so stay tuned for all of that. But thank you guys so much for stopping by, and I'll see you in the next one.